riot that ensued was a race riot. People were targeted on the basis of race, but the main brunt of the attacks was the Korean community.
Isn't that the way to overcome racism?
This month actually marks the 20th anniversary of the LA riots, and a new documentary takes a closer look at racial tensions, both before and after. Joining us in studio tonight is D.Kim, producer of this new documentary, Clash of Colors. And first of all, welcome to the studio.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
It will be 20 years, April 29th. What possessed you to start working on the documentary?
Well, it turns out, if you watch the documentary, you will see that I was actually one of the people that was involved at the time. Having been there and having the first-hand knowledge of the events of the riots, 10 years later, I saw that there really was no a proper documentary that showed what really happened, particularly to the Korean American community. Mm-hmm. And so I felt obligated as a person who was there and who had witnessed the events both before, during, and after the riots.
When you say you were there, where were you during the riots?
I was actually at the...
Well, let me just point out before we go any further, this is obviously the beating of Rodney King. And just to give people an idea, if they're not familiar with this, there was a beating in March 3rd, 91, and then a year later, the officers, the 4 white officers who were involved in the beating, were acquitted in Simi Valley. It really, the flashpoint here was Florence and Normandy with Reginald Denny when he was beaten in the truck there. Now, I'm sorry to interrupt here. Where were you in regards to all of this?
I was actually in Koreatown, as I was, I received a phone call, and I was supposed to meet with a city officer, city official actually. We were planning to try to do something that would improve the so-called Black-Korean relationship. And then I was called by my ex-wife, and we went home, and we could actually see the burning of Los Angeles on television. But on radio, Korean radio, mm-hmm. Korean ethnic radio, you could hear the voices of these shop owners who had not been able to flee, who were still stuck in those stores and were frantically calling the police and saying that they needed, they were calling the police, but the police were saying that they cannot come to help them.
What's the bottom line? What did you find out with the documentary? We know what precipitated the riots. Was it all about racism?
Well, actually, what we did discover is that it turned out that the Korean American community actually suffered. Actually, if you go back, there were $1 billion in property damage, and 400 million of that was suffered by Korean shopkeepers who have not been compensated since that time.
Why do you think it is they suffered disproportionately?
It turns out, well, I guess the first thing is that they were doing business in South LA at the time. But that is what the documentary explores. I interviewed with many scholars, such as Ivan Light of UCLA, Leo Estrada, and then I also interviewed LA Times former columnist. And basically the conclusion is that because the Korean American community did not really have a voice at the time, and the media at the time was having an exaggerated coverage of the tension between these two communities. And on top of that, there was a video that was released right after the Rodney King beating where Latasha Hollins was shot by a Korean grocer. Mm-hmm. And by having that shown over and over, the African American community felt that, and that person was given probation for killing Latasha Hollins by a judge, Joyce Collins.
So you maintain that the media had something to do with all of this?
No, I'm saying that at the time the media's focus on the tension and not showing the Korean American community working together to try to ease the tension was never shown.
What have you seen now, 20 years later? How have things changed, or have they changed at all?
I think first of all, the media's attitude towards the tension and the relationship between these ethnic communities and the African American community has improved greatly. I mean, I think they have come to understand that it's not simply cultural differences, but rather the real reason was, if you have to remember, in 1991, there was a big recession at the time.
There was a great deal of unemployment.
Right, and so there were a lot of anger that was stemming from the economic recession. And they kind of needed somewhere to explode this steam. And it turned out that the Korean Americans kind of happened to be there, and as
They were in the neighborhood. They were there. They were doing business at the time.
But the problem is the day after the riots, the rioters came up to Koreatown, which is about 2 miles north of South LA, and the Los Angeles Police Department decided that that was not the area that they wanted to protect, and that was very disappointing to a lot of Korean Americans who were living in those areas.
Well, we'd love to see the documentary, so if you would tell us where we can see it and when it becomes available. When does it start?
Okay, well, should I show like this?
Sure, or you can tell me, too. That would be great.
Sure.
I don't know if can we get a shot of this? It's called Clash of Colors.
And it's going to be shown at a brand new cinema that was built in Koreatown by CJ Entertainment. And it's going to be shown there's going to be a private screening on the 25th. And then there will be a public screening for 3 days. And it's actually, as you can see at the bottom, there's all these different sponsors. And they have graciously allowed these the screening to be complimentary. So
great. Okay.
That all they have to do is go into lariotsdocumentary.com and reserve tickets, and they will be able to come and watch.
So Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, April 26th, 27th, and 28th. And, of course, the anniversary is on the 29th, April 29th.
Right.
All right. Thank you so much for coming in.
Okay, thank
Certainly
you.
appreciate it.
Okay.